Good day and welcome to this new series. My name is David de Kock and we are calling the series The Rise of Christianity. We could have called it Church History, but that's a bit boring. Our first session begins today by looking at the Apostolic Church, the development of the church in Asia Minor and also in Europe. Much of our session is not going to be about what we read about in the book of Acts, because you can read all of that there. We're going to take a look at the way in which the world was developing and the way in which the church developed in that scenario. So let's start by looking at the birth of the church. It had early Jewish foundations. Remember, Jesus was a Jew. His followers were Jewish. The earliest Christians spoke Aramaic. The first Jewish Christian community was founded in Jerusalem, where the disciples remained after the Ascension and the first Christian Pentecost. All the new congregations were dependent on Jerusalem, and in 49 AD, the first Christian council was held in Jerusalem to resolve the relationship between Gentile Christians and the Jewish law of Moses. Refer Acts chapter 15. The early Christians continued to worship in the temple. Acts chapter 2 and verse 46, and again in 21 verses 17 to 26. They continued to observe Jewish law, Jewish ceremonies, and Jewish dietary regulations, which in this context went beyond the Pentateuch to include also the rabbinic teachings. The membership consisted of Jews and of converts to Judaism, not Gentiles. They were essentially a Jewish community. Initially, therefore, Christianity was considered to be a sect of Judaism. So, for example, in Acts chapter 24 and verse 5, we read about the Nazarene sect. And in Acts chapter 26 and verse 5, we read about the Pharisee sect. Their particular viewpoint within Judaism was the belief in Jesus as Messiah, his resurrection and his imminent return to establish the kingdom. They also practiced ritual baptism, which had by this time also become a rite for converts into Judaism. And they also practiced the Eucharist, a feast of thanksgiving. Because Judaism had special protection as a religion within the empire, in fact it was the only religion that had this special protection, Christianity, as part of that, was considered a sect within Judaism, and so therefore also received this special protection until the Jewish insurrection, which took place in 66 AD. But then the church moved into the Gentile world. The first factor in the spread into the Gentile world came about because of the two separate Jewish parts that comprised the early church. There were the Hebraic Jews, those Jews who had been born in Palestine and who spoke Aramaic, and the Hellenistic Jews, those Jews who were born outside of Palestine and were generally Greek-speaking. The first opposition to Christianity came from the Hellenistic Jews, evidenced in the stoning of Stephen, which you can read about in Acts chapter 6 and 7. Important to note that St. Paul was a Hellenistic Jew. As a result of this, the Greek-speaking Jewish Christian community was scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. The apostles and the Hebraic Christians remained in Jerusalem. The second factor was a man by the name of Saul of Tarsus. After his conversion, which we read about in Acts chapter 9 on the road to Damascus, where he was going to persecute Christians, his name was changed to Paul, and he became the founder of the mission to the Gentiles, particularly in Asia Minor, but he also spread it out into Europe. And the third factor was the acceptance by the council in Jerusalem, which I've already referred to in Acts chapter 15, which was a council, in fact, of Hebraic Jews, that Gentiles could become Christians without complying first to the Mosaic law. The later significance of this was that it meant that the church was not tied to Jewish nationalism. That's important to remember as we go on. In 66 AD, with the Jewish insurrection against the Romans, the Christians didn't consider themselves to be part of the uprising, which was primarily a nationalist cause. And so they left Jerusalem and they fled to the city of Pella in the Decapolis region, east of the Jordan River, up near Galilee. This event also gave rise to the persecution of the Christians by the Jews, who felt that they should have joined the cause against the Romans. By 70 AD, with the destruction of the temple, Jewish religious observances became centered in the synagogues because there was no temple anymore, and was focused primarily on Jewish nationalism and in strict observance of the law. As a result, there was a rigid exclusion of Christians from Jewish religious observances. The church then became Gentile, but they still considered themselves to be the new Israel. Two small groups of Jewish Christians remained. There were the Nazarenes, they were the followers of Peter and James and Paul, and the Ebionites, who held to the old Pharisaic position requiring continued observance of the Mosaic law, that is, the Judaizers. But basically, Christianity was no longer a Jewish sect, but a religion on its own in the Graeco-Roman world. The center began to shift from Jerusalem to Rome, and it faced new challenges. Learning to be Catholic, meaning whole or complete, and contextually meaningful in each specific situation. So let's now look at the Greco-Roman world. Despite its Jewish origin, Christianity was born into the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, that covered the whole known world at the time. Pax Romana simply means the peace of Rome, and it refers to the tranquility and the security that the Roman Empire brought into the Mediterranean world. The Pax Romana lasted from the reign of Caesar Augustus, that's 27 BC to AD 14, which is when he reigned, to the reign of Caesar Marcus Aurelius from AD 161 to 180. At the time of Christ and during the first generation of the church, much of the world was unified under Roman authority, and it enjoyed a relative peace. The Pax Romana, therefore, provided ease of travel due to a well-developed and a well-maintained road system, safety in travel due to the absence of warfare and stepped-up crime prevention by the presence of Roman soldiers nearly everywhere, and the extensive use of Greek as the common language of the Mediterranean. These developments provided the perfect environment for the gospel to spread quickly throughout the civilized world. Civil protections for citizens and residents of the empire, as long as they were not considered a threat to the Pax Romana, also allowed the early Christians some freedom in sharing something which was essentially an unpopular message at the time. Roman imperial culture and Greek philosophical ideas were, however, to have a significant impact on the development of Christianity over the next few centuries. And we're going to look at 4 of these. The The first was Plato's philosophy, which greatly influenced the early Christian debate regarding the nature of God. Second, Aristotle's philosophy was the basis of much of the scholastic movement in the church, particularly during the late Middle Ages. Third, pilgrims to Greek oracles paved the way for monasticism to grow in the church. And four, the Roman magisterial structure significantly influenced church organization as well. So let's look then at the influence of Plato. Plato, who lived from 427 to 348 BC, was Socrates' student and Aristotle's teacher. And he was the founder of the only rigorously non-materialist philosophical tradition in the West, and was therefore a major philosophical resource for Christian theology. Plato believed in one God, that humans came down to earth from a pre-mortal existence with God and will either go back up to heaven or down to hell when they die. The Christian's concept of a person's ultimate end being either in heaven above the earth or in hell below comes to us from Plato. And this binary concept essentially replaced Paul's teachings in the New Testament of the three heavens or the 3 degrees of glory. Plato also believed in a dualistic view of existence, a temporal world and a non-material world. This physical world, he said, was created by a transcendent eternal being, a master craftsman who initiated time and fashioned this material universe in replica of a pre-existing eternal model. This eternal model is the essence of and more real than the physical substance that we touch with our hands and see with our eyes. While he did hold that this material world is good because it was created after a perfect model, he also suggested that it had flaws which had been created by other cooperating lesser gods in the creative process. Early Christians liked this concept and they adapted it to a belief that God imbued the tainted matter of creation with a portion of his grace and was thereby intimately involved in the affairs of this mortal world. This concept was referred to as realism due to the idea that the spiritual forms were more real than the physical realm. And this formed the basis for a strong belief in God's providence that permeated Christendom throughout the Middle Ages and still has echoes until this day. Much of the politics of Catholicism was derived from Plato. The ideas of heaven, purgatory, and hell in their medieval form are traceable to the teachings of Plato. Purgatory, for those who are not aware of it, was the place in Roman Catholic theology where those who die in a state of grace but not yet clean from the stain of sin suffer temporal punishment in a purification process. The influence of Plato on early and basic Christian theology can hardly be overstated. So let's turn now to look at the influence of Aristotle. Aristotle, who lived from 385 to 323 BC, was one of Plato's star pupils. He built his philosophy on much of what Plato taught, but he diverged from him in many ways. One of Aristotle's greatest contributions was his creation of logic as science. He developed formulas to test and correct ideas and propositions. He determined that correct thinking can be distilled down to universal rules, such as we find in maths and physics, and can be taught to any normal person. His work then became the foundation of medieval scholasticism, the rational approach to theology that dominated Roman Catholic ideas in the High and Late Middle Ages, and which was rejected by the Protestants at that time. Aristotle's teaching that virtue is realized through an active life of moderation complemented Socrates' teaching that virtue is obtained with knowledge and Plato's quest for harmony. Together, they formed the foundation of the Greco-Roman culture that valued reason practically more than anything else. The Stoics were a philosophical school that developed out of these teachings and which had the greatest impact on Christian ideas and practices. They taught that a virtuous life was obtained through living a life of reason, but without any passion in it. They viewed passion as a corrupting outside influence that moved people, hence the term motion is contained in the word emotion. The most wise and virtuous person, according to them, has no passion at all. So let's now turn to the development of monasticism. We've seen the Stoics. Now we also had the Epicurean schools that developed from Aristotle's teaching. They formed into communal centers where moral standards were taught and where followers lived an ascetic lifestyle. These tight communities were a rough model of that followed by Jewish separatist groups such as the Essenes, the group that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, and subsequently by monks and nuns in Christian monastic orders. Monasteries and convents both sprang into existence in large measure as a reaction to the increased Hellenization of Judaism and subsequently also of Christianity. The emphasis of these Greek schools on the ascetic lifestyle has had a major impact on Christianity. In addition to all of this, there existed a number of female oracles which played a major role in Hellenistic society. An oracle was a person who acted as a medium who spoke on behalf of a god and was the source of wisdom and prophetic utterances. The word oracle means one who speaks. It's as simple as that. The Oracle of Delphi was the most popular and influential oracle in ancient Greece, with hordes of people, including wealthy citizens and rulers, flocking to seek guidance from her and from her assistants. Pilgrimages to various oracles were a regular aspect of the Hellenistic world. This tradition continued on into Christendom, with hermits, renowned monks, and relics replacing the oracles as the source of wisdom and healing. We turn now to the Roman influence on church organization. In the initial biblical pattern, the local churches were small, with an elder or an overseer. The word was either presbyteros, from which we get presbyter or elder, or episkopos, from which we get the word bishop. The words appear sometimes to be used interchangeably by Paul, but if we compare to John's churches in the book of Revelation, it appears that larger churches had groups of elders, presbyteros, of which one was the overseer, the episkopos. By mid-century, 2nd century, most churches had adopted this pattern of a group of elders and an overseer. But as the church grew, things got complicated. The pattern began to follow the structure of Roman government, with one main overseer over a city who was called a metropolitan, and minor overseers, bishops, who were over nearby smaller towns and who reported to the metropolitan. By the 3rd century, 3 metropolitans were given a new status, the status of patriarch: Alexandria over Egypt and Libya, Rome over Italy, Carthage, Spain, and the Germanic kingdoms, and Antioch over the Middle Eastern areas. With the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD, under the combined pressure of barbarian invasions, economic collapse, and societal pressures, the Roman Patriarch was the only patriarch in the West, and soon he gained authority over all of the churches, as well as the spiritual subservience of the so-called Christian kings of the barbarians. Under the wing of Charlemagne and his successors, the Roman Patriarch found significant protection as the religious leader of the West, which led to the schism of 1054 between the West, Rome, and East, Constantinople churches. In 1059, Pope Nicholas II vested the right to name a new pope to the College of Cardinals, which was based in Rome. The structure now began to mirror the structure of the now collapsed Roman Empire, with the Pope virtually an ecclesiastical equivalent to Caesar, and the College of Cardinals mirroring the former Roman Senate. And this was further exacerbated by the excommunication of Henry IV of Germany by Pope Gregory VII for his disobedience to papal commands. A further decree that civil rulers could not invest churchmen with temporal power led to the papacy becoming the most important and influential institution in Europe well into the 19th century. Now, while we might look critically at the Roman Catholic Church as forming along worldly lines, we must not forget that other denominations have succumbed to the same intentions. Denominations are mostly structured in a similar way, even without the historic legacy of Rome. Modern independent churches today often follow modern corporate structures, with the minister as president or CEO. There are financial officers, there are marketing departments, and so on. The biblical structure for the church was mostly developed for smaller communities, and it followed the form of the Jewish synagogue. Perhaps it works best that way. Next week, we are going to look at the development of the church in North Africa, which followed a very different but quite interesting line, even leading to the first creed or doctrinal statement of the church. I look forward to being with you then. It's going to be really interesting as we look at the growth of the church in Africa. So I'm not really going to focus too much on having discussion pointers. You can, in your group, you can just discuss the whole talk. But today I want to give you just one thought to think about. A significant focus of the talk today has been about structure and organization rather than about the development of theology. And that's probably not unusual at the beginning of something new. So in your groups, talk about how your organization developed its current structure. Ask yourself, does it still fulfill its purpose?